You ever get that uncanny feeling like you're walking down the street, totally lost in thought, and bam, you bump into someone you haven't seen since like grade school?
Mm-hmm.
It feels like more than just chance, doesn't it? We
Yeah.
usually shrug it off, small world, weird coincidence.
Hmm.
But what if there's something else going on?
That feeling of significance, that little spark of wonder.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a very human response to unexpected connections.
exactly. And that's really the jumping off point for today's deep dive. You, our curious listeners, have sent in just a fantastic collection of questions all about the brain's inner workings.
A great batch this time.
Yeah. We're going to explore everything from those gut feelings we call intuition and the strange familiarity of déjà vu to, well, the science of dreams, the amazing adaptability of neuroplasticity,
Mm.
and even how artificial intelligence is changing how we think about our own intelligence.
It's quite a mix.
It's a real mix of fascinating stuff, the kind of things that make you go, I wonder about that, you know.
A true reflection of the brain's multifaceted nature, definitely.
And who better to guide us through this than, well, me, your resident absorber of interesting information, and our insightful expert who can always seem to cut through the noise and find the real story.
I try my best.
Our goal today is to unpack these brain mysteries, separate the solid science from the maybe speculation, and leave you feeling genuinely enlightened, not, totally overwhelmed.
Yeah, we're aiming to provide some solid ground in areas often filled with more questions than answers.
Okay, so let's get right into that feeling of a meaningful coincidence, that intuitive nudge. We've all experienced it, right? Like in one of our sources, that story of bumping into a childhood friend after decades apart.
Mm-hmm. The classic example.
Or even those more striking examples, like the two people in the crowded Moscow metro who just happen to cross paths despite missed plans and it feels like fate or something more. Is it really just random chance?
Well, that immediately brings up a very basic question about how we perceive reality, doesn't it? First and foremost, it's important to recognize that we don't really have any scientifically verified data that definitively proves these events are anything other than chance.
Right.
As one of our sources humorously suggested, many of these seemingly extraordinary moments often have perfectly ordinary explanations, like pulling back the curtain on a magic trick,
Right. The mystery solved, often with a bit of a chuckle.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's push a little further. Even if we did have undeniable proof of something that seems outside our current understanding, say, solid evidence for past lives or out-of-body experiences, what would that actually mean for us? Would it fundamentally change how we see the world? Or should we still be looking for explanations within the scientific framework we already have?
That's a critical point to consider. Scientists are often working at the edge of what's known, exploring the unexplained. Even when surprising results pop up in experiments, like, remember that early incorrect finding about neutrino mass? The scientific method involves careful examination and, crucially, the possibility of errors. It's incredibly challenging, maybe even impossible, to definitively prove the existence of things that are completely outside our current scientific grasp through experimentation alone.
Okay, so hard proof in these areas is elusive, to say the least. Our source mentions something about how our fundamental beliefs play a role here.
Precisely. Believing in non-physical or seemingly mystical things isn't really about running experiments or doing practical tests. It's more about whether you can build a consistent conceptual framework, a way of thinking that requires those things to be true.
Okay.
For example, the idea that information could come from the future or the concept of a divine power influencing events, these aren't things you can easily put under a microscope, so to speak.
That makes sense. It comes down to your basic assumptions about how the universe operates. Okay, let's switch gears to something almost everyone can relate to. Déjà vu. That really strange sensation of having experienced a situation before, even then you haven't.
Ah, yes, déjà vu. It is indeed a fascinating experience, and as our source pointed out, so are similar phenomena like jamais vu, where familiar things suddenly seem foreign.
The opposite, sort of.
Exactly, and even conditions like the Capgras delusion, where people believe their loved ones have been replaced by identical imposters.
Wow.
These experiences really highlight something important about our brains. The difference between us recognizing something, like a face or a place, and our brain's interpretation of that recognition, the feeling that goes with it.
The evil twin syndrome. That's such a bizarre and honestly unsettling thing to imagine.
It is. Our source shed a powerful example of a young man who, after a car accident, would happily talk to his father on the phone,
Okay.
but then react with fear and claim his father was an imposter when he visited in person.
Whoa. So what was the explanation?
Well, the proposed explanation suggests a disconnect between the auditory parts of his brain, which still held on to those warm emotional memories associated with his father's voice,
Oh.
and the visual parts, which perhaps due to the trauma didn't trigger that same emotional connection when he saw his father's face.
So he'd hear his dad and feel the love, the familiarity.
Yeah.
But when he saw him, that emotional signal was just missing, leading to this "he's not my real dad" feeling.
Exactly. The brain is constantly trying to make sense of the information it receives. So in that gap, that cognitive dissonance, the interpretation became imposter. Similarly, déjà vu and jamais vu might arise from the complex structure and processing of our brains, where feelings of familiarity or novelty can get a bit mixed up or misattributed.
So it's less likely to be a glitch in the matrix or a peek into a past life,
Probably.
and more about the intricate and sometimes, fellow workings of our own minds. Our source briefly mentioned the multiverse theory as a possible way to explain déjà vu, but then wisely brought us back to the neurological and psychological aspects.
Yeah, while those kinds of speculative ideas can be, fun to think about, they don't currently have any real scientific support. It's generally more productive to look at the mechanisms within the brain itself that could be causing these subjective experiences.
Right, and then there's the Mandela effect, this really odd phenomenon of large groups of people misremembering the same past event, like the widespread belief that Nelson Mandela died in prison years ago.
Ah, the Mandela effect, yes, where many people share a false memory about something that didn't actually happen that way. It likely stems from things like confabulations, our brain filling in gaps, and the creation of false memories.
Where do those come from?
Well, they can arise from various sources, sometimes maybe even our dreams, or just the power of suggestion, or simply incorrect information spreading widely until it feels like fact.
Okay, so our brains are pretty good at constructing stories, even if those stories aren't always, strictly accurate. Now, let's talk about something a lot of people notice. Seeing repeating numbers,
Yeah.
like 11.1 or 22.22 popping up frequently on clocks or receipts or whatever. What's the deal with that? Is there some hidden message?
Well, from a psychological perspective, noticing repeating number sequences is usually quite straightforward. It's primarily down to what we call selective attention.
Ah,
Our brains are constantly looking for patterns. It's what they do. And once we happen to notice a repeating number, maybe just by chance, that pattern becomes more prominent in our awareness. It stands out. So we're then more likely to spot it again in the future, while we completely overlook the countless non-repeating numbers we encounter every day.
so it's like when you decide you want to buy a certain type of car, and suddenly you start seeing that exact car everywhere on the road. It was always there, you just weren't noticing.
Precisely. It's a form of confirmation bias. If you start to believe these numbers hold some significance, you'll subconsciously pay more attention to them, and their appearance will feel meaningful, reinforcing the belief.
Right.
Our source gave a fun example of someone thinking they could make the bus arrive faster by counting pigeons if the bus happens to show up right after they finish counting one time.
They think, it worked.
Exactly. It reinforces that perceived connection, even though it's almost certainly just a coincidence.
Right. We're wired to find connections, even if they're not really there.
Hmm.
Our source also mentioned that our internal biological rhythms might play a role in when we happen to notice these patterns, like looking at the clock.
That's an interesting angle, yeah. Our internal sense of time might subtly influence when we glance at a clock, potentially increasing the chances of catching those repeating digits just by probability.
Okay, now let's dive into a really fascinating area. Seemingly prophetic dreams. We had a listener write in about a friend who has these incredibly vivid dreams that later come true. Not just vague feelings, but like specific details matching up.
Yes. This kind of claim is notoriously difficult to verify scientifically. While personal stories can be very compelling, they just don't provide the kind of rigorous, objective evidence needed for scientific validation.
So how could you test it?
Well, if someone truly believes they have prophetic dreams, the most effective way to investigate this would be to meticulously record every detail of the dream. The more specific and unusual, the better before the predicted event occurs.
Beforehand, that's key.
Absolutely. It's crucial to avoid vague interpretations that could easily be applied to a wide range of situations after something has already happened.
That makes total sense. You need clear, documented predictions beforehand, not just retrofitting. Our source also brought up the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies in relation to this.
Exactly. That's another important factor. The very act of having a dream about a future event could subconsciously influence a person's behavior, making the dreamt scenario more likely to happen.
How so?
For instance, someone who dreams vividly about spilling coffee might, the next morning, be slightly more clumsy or distracted around their mug, perhaps unconsciously, leading to the very spill they envisioned.
It's like your mind is subtly nudging reality, or at least your actions, to match the dream. And then, of course, there's just the simple reality of coincidences in a big world.
Right. That's a huge factor. In a world with billions of people and countless events happening every single day, statistically improbable occurrences are actually bound to happen occasionally just by pure chance. It doesn't necessarily point to any special ability or supernatural influence.
Like lottery winners.
Exactly. Think about lottery winners. It's incredibly unlikely for any one specific person to win, but given the millions of tickets sold, it's virtually guaranteed that someone will win. The same principle applies here. We also need to consider the nature of the dreams themselves. Are they really full of specific, unique, verifiable details that then occur precisely as dreamt?
Or are they more general?
Or are they more general, more symbolic, maybe open to interpretation after the fact? A dream about some kind of accident involving a blue car could fit a lot of different situations later on.
Good point. Our source even suggested the idea of a listener-initiated study where people systematically record their dreams.
That kind of organized perspective approach would yield much more useful information than relying on individual retrospective anecdotes. Furthermore, it's important to remember that our memory isn't like a perfect video recorder. It's reconstructive, meaning we rebuild memories each time we recall them. People can unintentionally alter their memory of a dream after an event happens to make it seem like a more accurate prediction than it actually was. They might misremember specific details like the color of the car to make it fit better.
Our memory is surprisingly flexible, isn't it? Almost creative sometimes. Our source did acknowledge the occasional striking dream that seems incredibly significant, like the famous story of Mendeleev supposedly dreaming the structure of the periodic table.
Right, those stories are certainly fascinating and they stick in our minds. But it's crucial to remember that they seem to be quite rare, and they often occur when someone is deeply, intensely immersed in a particular problem or area of study.
So he wasn't just idly dreaming.
Probably not. Mendeleev was already intensely focused on the patterns of the chemical elements. His dream might have been a manifestation of all that deep cognitive work, his brain making connections during sleep, rather than a purely random flash of insight arriving from nowhere. We should be cautious about relying solely on dreams versus dedicated conscious effort and intellectual engagement.
That makes sense. Our source also brought in the perspective of a sleep expert, Vladimir Alipov, who sounds quite skeptical about the scientific study of dreams in general.
Yes, Kovalzon highlights the inherently subjective and elusive nature of dreams. They're private experiences, hard to capture objectively, which makes them incredibly difficult to study using rigorous scientific methods. Consider that vivid French Revolution dream anecdote our source mentioned.
Yeah, the one where the whole complex dream happened in a split second.
Exactly. The idea that an entire complex dream narrative could potentially unfold in the fleeting moments just before waking up, it really throws into question our perception of time within dreams.
It really makes you wonder about the actual timescale of a dream. And our source mentioned the ongoing uncertainty about eye movements during REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and whether they directly correspond to what we're seeing in the dream.
Precisely. Even the physiological markers we use to study sleep and dreams, like REM, have their limitations in telling us exactly what the subjective experience is like. Furthermore, the analogy of garbage in, garbage out for dreams is quite thought-provoking.
How does that apply?
The idea is that dreams might simply be a chaotic jumble, a mix of random neural activity, fragmented memories from the day, maybe older memories bubbling up, and then our waking brain, upon reflection, tries to piece it all together into some kind of coherent but not necessarily meaningful story.
So our brain is a natural storyteller, always trying to make a narrative, even when the raw ingredients are pretty random bits and pieces. But our source did also point out that dreams might offer clues about our emotional state, even if not predicting the future.
That's a potentially valuable insight, yes. The story about the astronauts having dreams about fighting with each other.
Right, before they even realized there was tension.
Exactly. It highlights how dream content can sometimes reflect underlying stress, anxieties, or unresolved emotional issues that maybe we aren't consciously acknowledging. So while interpreting dreams for specific, profound, literal meanings is largely speculative, they might provide a general indication of our emotional well-being.
So recurring dreams, or particularly disturbing
Oh,
ones.
yeah. Those could certainly be worth exploring, perhaps even talking about with a therapist, as they might signal something that needs attention on an emotional level.
Definitely something to consider. And a little side note from our source. While some people are fascinated by hearing about other people's dreams, many others find it incredibly boring.
Chuckles lightly. Yes, something to keep in mind perhaps for your next breakfast conversation.
Indeed. Now let's move on to a more fundamental question. Why do we dream at all? What purpose, if any, do these nightly mental adventures actually serve?
It seems like there are quite a few different ideas floating around about that. Our source started with the ecological theory, the idea that sleep and dreaming helped keep our ancestors safe.
How so?
The ecological theory suggests that sleep and perhaps dreaming just comes along for the ride, primarily evolved to reduce activity during times when it was risky or unproductive. Think nocturnal animals resting during the day.
Stay hidden, conserve energy.
Exactly. The main function of sleep, according to this view, is primarily inactivity, not necessarily physical or cognitive restoration in the ways we usually think about it. The theory even points to studies on those rare individuals with genetic mutations who seem to need significantly less sleep without apparent negative health effects.
Which kind of challenges the idea that everyone needs 8 hours.
It does raise questions about the absolute necessity of long sleep durations for everyone. However, there's a counter-argument suggesting that maybe a sleep needs center exists in the brain, and that insufficient sleep could trigger harmful biological processes even if we don't feel tired. So the idea that sleep is just about inactivity is still debated.
Okay, so maybe sleep is more about knowing when not to be active, evolutionarily speaking. Our source briefly touched on the visceral information processing theory, but mentioned it's not widely accepted.
That's correct. It proposes that dreams are the brain's way of processing internal bodily signals, but there isn't strong evidence to support it. A more prominent theory these days is synaptic homeostasis.
Right, the idea that our brain sort of tidies up during sleep, prunes back unnecessary connections to keep things efficient.
Exactly. The theory suggests that we form lots of new neural connections during the day as we learn and experience things, maybe some are temporary or redundant. Sleep, then, allows the brain to scale back or prune these connections, preventing our circuits from becoming overloaded and maintaining the efficiency of our neural networks.
Makes intuitive sense. Is there good evidence?
Well, solid evidence for this specifically in humans is still somewhat lacking, and even studies in animals have produced mixed results. So while it's a compelling idea, the evidence isn't quite definitive yet.
Okay. What about the glymphatic system, the idea that our brain literally cleans itself out during sleep? That sounds important.
The glymphatic system theory proposes that the brain clears out metabolic waste products, things like amyloid beta, which is implicated in Alzheimer's much more effectively during sleep, especially during deep, slow-wave sleep.
How does it do that?
It's thought to happen because of increased fluid flow through specific channels alongside blood vessels in the brain, washing away the waste. This cleaning process might be disrupted by conditions like high blood pressure. However,
There's a but.
there's a but. The very existence and overall importance of the glymphatic system are still being actively debated in the scientific community. Some studies haven't been able to reproduce the initial exciting findings. Our source even mentioned a researcher being quite upset about a critical paper being published near Nobel Prize time. It really highlights how dynamic and sometimes contentious scientific understanding can be.
Wow. Sounds like that's still a hot area of research with some significant disagreements. Finally, our source mentioned information processing and memory consolidation as a potential key purpose of dreaming, or at least sleep.
Yes, this is a major theory. It suggests that sleep, and maybe dreaming as part of it, plays a crucial role in processing experiences from the day and solidifying them into lasting memories. The classic example often cited is the study of rats that learn to run a maze.
And then their brains replayed it during sleep.
Exactly. Researchers observed the same patterns of neural activity that occurred while running the maze being replayed in the rats' brains during sleep, often faster and sometimes even in reverse. The big question, though, is whether this neural replay actually equates to the rat consciously dreaming of running the maze in the way we understand dreaming.
Right, we can't ask the rat.
We can't. It's possible that dreaming, as we experience it subjectively, is simply a byproduct, like the conscious awareness of this important memory reactivation process happening under the hood. So while the brain might be doing crucial memory work, our experience of that as a dream might be a separate, secondary phenomenon.
So the brain might be doing important memory consolidation behind the scenes, And dreams are just what happens when we become slightly aware of some of that complex activity.
Hmm.
It really highlights how much we're still learning, doesn't it? Our source touched on that listener observation about memory problems when we don't get enough sleep, which seems to support the memory consolidation idea.
Well, there's an alternative explanation for that, too. Sleep deprivation might lead to what's called local sleep in certain areas of the brain the following day.
Local sleep.
Yeah, it means parts of your brain might be briefly slipping into a sleep-like state, becoming less responsive even while you're technically awake. This could certainly impair cognitive functions like memory retrieval, making it feel like you didn't learn anything, rather than indicating a complete failure to actually consolidate those memories the night before.
Okay.
And actually, some recent research even suggests that the direct link between sleep duration and long-term memory consolidation might be more complex, maybe less direct than we previously thought.
Interesting. So it might be more about your brain being temporarily less efficient at accessing memories the next day, rather than those memories having never been stored properly in the first place. Okay, let's tackle the common belief that sleep is absolutely vital for our immune system. Get sick if you don't sleep right.
Well, studies on animals that have been severely, and I mean severely sleep deprived, have definitely shown disruptions in their immune systems. Things like changes in the levels of certain immune signaling molecules called cytokines.
Oh.
But it's important to remember that these were often extreme, prolonged sleep loss scenarios, not just pulling one all-nighter. Melatonin, a hormone that peaks during our sleep cycle, has also been linked to immune function.
But does that explain needing 8 hours?
Well, that's the question. Its peak production is relatively short, which makes you wonder if it fully explains our apparent need for a full 7 to 8 hours of sleep for optimal immune health. Another idea is the oxidative stress hypothesis.
Which is?
It suggests that lack of sleep might disrupt the function of our cells' energy factories, the mitochondria, leading to an increase in damaging molecules called free radicals. This oxidative stress can then impair various bodily systems, potentially including the immune system.
Okay, so really severe sleep deprivation definitely seems to have a negative impact physiologically. What about more typical variations in sleep duration among humans?
Epidemiological data looking at large populations does show a correlation between regularly sleeping less than about 7 hours or more than 8 to 9 hours and a shorter lifespan on average.
More than 8 hours, too.
Yeah, but it's crucial to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. For instance, oversleeping could easily be a symptom of underlying health issues that are actually shortening lifespan, rather than the long sleep itself being the cause.
Good point.
So while more research is definitely needed to pin down the exact mechanisms, the current evidence generally suggests that getting somewhere around 7-8 hours of sleep per night is likely the sweet spot for overall health and well-being for most adults.
Sounds like aiming for that 7-8 hour window is generally a good recommendation.
Hmm.
Okay, now let's delve into the somewhat mysterious topic of hypnosis. What exactly is happening in the brain during hypnosis, scientifically speaking, and how does mainstream science view it?
From a scientific perspective, hypnosis is generally understood as primarily a state of heightened suggestibility.
Suggestibility.
Okay. Individuals who are naturally more open to suggestion, perhaps more easily persuaded, and maybe even more prone to forming false memories, tend to be more susceptible to hypnotic influence. This increased suggestibility can manifest in various ways, including sometimes contributing to conditions like somatoform disorders, things like hysterical blindness, where a person genuinely believes they are blind despite no underlying physical cause for it. The mind creates the symptom.
So the power of suggestion can lead to very real feeling, sensory or physical experiences, even without a physical basis.
Exactly. However, it's important to note that hypnosis doesn't work the same way for everyone. Susceptibility varies greatly, and its practical usefulness can be quite inconsistent. While some people explore using hypnosis to try and recover lost memories.
Like in therapy or investigations.
Yeah, but there's a significant risk of actually creating false memories during this process. Both the therapist and the hypnotized person might unintentionally construct or elaborate on imagined scenarios that then feel real. Because of these kinds of issues and the variability, mainstream medical science generally considers hypnosis to be a form of complementary or alternative medicine, not a core therapeutic tool for most conditions.
Okay, so caution is definitely warranted, especially when it comes to hypnosis and memory recall. That leads us nicely into the broader ideas of self-programming and the placebo effect. We've already touched on hysterical blindness as an extreme example.
Yeah.
What else can you tell us about the power of our own beliefs on our bodies and minds?
The placebo effect in medicine provides a really powerful illustration. For instance, numerous studies on antidepressants have shown that their effectiveness is often surprisingly comparable to that of an inactive placebo pill.
Really? As effective as a sugar pill?
In many cases, yes, particularly for mild to moderate depression. This highlights the significant impact of our expectations just believing you're getting treatment, and the power of self-suggestion on our perceived well-being and symptoms. We see similar effects in conditions like hypochondria, where the strong belief in illness can lead to the experience of physical symptoms, and perhaps even in how our bodies seem to respond more positively to perceived healing efforts in less severe situations when we have a positive outlook.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it, how much our minds can influence our physical state.
Right.
What's the current scientific understanding of how the placebo effect actually works? What's the mechanism?
Current scientific understanding suggests that the placebo effect primarily influences our subjective experiences, things like how we perceive pain or fatigue or nausea. It can definitely change our perception of symptoms. It can also affect things like endurance or perceived effort.
Okay, so mostly subjective feelings. What about objective, measurable, physiological changes?
That's where it gets more debated. Animal studies have hinted at the possibility of consciously influencing autonomic functions, things normally outside our control, like heart rate, blood pressure, maybe even hormone secretion through intensive biofeedback-like training. But the evidence in humans is less clear and consistent. Some studies have shown that a placebo can objectively lower blood pressure to some extent.
Interesting.
But its effect on other measures, like heart rate, seems less reliable. So it seems to have a bigger and more consistent impact on how we feel, rather than necessarily causing large-scale objective biological changes across the board.
Okay. Our source specifically asked about whether a positive mindset can really impact the course of serious illnesses like cancer. That's a common belief.
Yes, it's a very common and appealing belief. The idea that maintaining a positive attitude can significantly improve recovery rates or survival time from serious diseases like cancer. However, when you look at large-scale statistical data from clinical trials and population studies, it doesn't generally support this idea.
So the stats don't back it up.
Not in terms of significantly altering the biological progression of the disease or overall survival rates for severe illnesses like advanced cancer. While there are certainly inspiring individual stories of people who maintain positivity and beat the odds, these anecdotal accounts don't reflect the broader statistical trends seen in large patient groups. It's also important to be extremely cautious about claims that conditions like diabetes can be controlled or cured through self-suggestion alone. This is definitely not supported by medical research and can be dangerous if it leads people to abandon proven treatments.
Right. So while staying positive is generally a good thing for coping and overall well-being, it's not a scientifically proven substitute for medical treatment for serious illnesses.
Exactly. And it's really important not to inadvertently blame patients if they struggle to maintain positivity while facing a difficult illness. However, what is clearly valuable is psychological support. While it might not directly cure the disease, things like therapy, stress reduction techniques, support groups, and focusing on overall well-being can significantly improve a patient's quality of life while they navigate their illness.
Absolutely. Quality of life is incredibly important. Okay, let's move on to a topic that has seen some fascinating and sometimes conflicting research over the years. Neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells, new neurons in adults. Are we still growing new brain cells as we get older?
That's a great question, and it's important to first clarify a common misunderstanding. Even if neurogenesis does occur in adults, it doesn't involve our existing mature nerve cells dividing like skin cells do. Instead, it would involve new neurons developing from a population of neural stem cells that might persist in certain brain areas.
Okay, so new cells from stem cells, not old cells dividing.
Correct. The discovery of these neural stem cells in the adult brain decades ago now initially raised the really exciting possibility that we could generate brand new functional neurons and integrate them into our existing brain circuits throughout life. Groundbreaking research, initially in birds, particularly songbirds, provided compelling evidence.
What did they find in birds?
They found seasonal changes in the size of brain regions involved in singing, linked to learning new songs each year. And crucially, they showed that the actual number of neurons in these areas increased and decreased seasonally. This was strong evidence for adult neurogenesis in at least some species.
That must have been a real game changer in neuroscience, challenging the old idea that the brain was fixed after development.
It absolutely was. It overturned decades of dogma. Subsequent research, mainly in rodents, provided initial findings suggesting that neurogenesis does also occur in adult mammalian brains, although this was initially met with quite a bit of skepticism because the long-held belief was no new neurons after birth in mammals. Then came some clever studies in humans. Researchers used the trace amounts of radioactive carbon, carbon-14, that got into the atmosphere from nuclear bomb testing in the mid-20th century. This C14 got incorporated into the DNA of dividing cells.
Including potential new neurons.
Exactly. By measuring the amount of C14 in the DNA of neurons from deceased individuals, they could essentially date when those neurons were born. And these studies did provide some evidence for the birth of some new neurons in specific parts of the adult human brain.
Using nuclear fallout to track brain cell birth, that's a pretty ingenious, is slightly unsettling method. But our source hinted that this process might be more limited in humans than we initially hoped or thought.
Yes, exactly. Over time, it became clearer that adult neurogenesis in mammals, including what little might occur in humans, appears to be restricted to very specific areas of the brain, mainly the subventricular zone, which seems to send new cells primarily to the olfactory bulb, involved in smell, and the hippocampus, a region crucial for learning and memory.
So not widespread regeneration.
Definitely not. And importantly, it doesn't seem to be a significant mechanism for repairing damaged areas of the brain after injury or stroke, for example. Furthermore, studies looking at the function of these new hippocampal neurons, mostly in rodents where researchers could specifically block neurogenesis, primarily showed deficits in tasks requiring the ability to distinguish between very similar environments or contexts.
Like telling two similar rooms apart.
Something like that. Which, while interesting, raised questions about the overall importance and specific critical role of this limited adult neurogenesis for major cognitive functions.
So even when it happens, it's in very specific regions, and its exact crucial function is still being actively investigated. And then, our source mentioned some recent and rather controversial research that throws a wrench into this whole picture for humans.
Yes, this is a big development. Recent advances in techniques for identifying specific types of brain cells much more accurately, using unique molecular markers, and analyzing their gene activity, a field called transcriptomics, have led to findings that seriously question whether significant adult neurogenesis occurs in the human hippocampus after early childhood at all.
Wait, so maybe it stops very early in humans.
That's what this recent research suggests. It indicates that cells previously identified as new neurons in adult human brains might actually be a type of support cell called glial cells, or perhaps immature neurons that never fully develop or integrate. According to this newer, more detailed research, there might be very little, if any, substantial generation of new functional neurons in the adult human brain, particularly the hippocampus.
Wow. That's quite a turnaround from where the field was maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
The idea of adult neurogenesis had become quite popular, linked to exercise and learning.
It absolutely has been a significant shift, and a controversial one within the field. The fact that there hasn't been a huge amount of definitive follow-up research published yet means there's still some uncertainty, some ongoing debate. It's also interesting that while we clearly see robust neurogenesis in adult rodents and some evidence in primates, there's also a relative lack of evidence for it in cetaceans, dolphins, and whales, which have large, complex brains.
So maybe it's not essential for complex cognition.
That's one implication being considered. Why might humans and whales lack it if rodents have it? We don't know yet. However, it's important to add a hopeful note. Even if significant adult neurogenesis doesn't happen naturally in humans throughout life, future research might still find ways to stimulate dormant stem cells or introduce new ones for therapeutic purposes, perhaps after brain injury or stroke. So the potential to harness the brain's regenerative abilities, even if limited naturally, might still be there down the line.
Okay, so the science on natural adult neurogenesis in humans might be taking a step back, or at least becoming more complex for now. But the brain's ability to change and adapt in other ways is definitely not in question, right? Let's talk about neuroplasticity.
Absolutely. Neuroplasticity is fundamental. It refers to the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections and modifying existing ones throughout life. This isn't about growing whole new neurons in most cases, but changing the connections between them.
The wiring.
Exactly, the wiring. Learning and experience lead to structural and functional changes at the connections between neurons called synapses. New connections can form, existing ones can get stronger, making communication easier, or others can weaken or be eliminated. This synaptic plasticity is the fundamental cellular basis of how our brain learns and remembers things.
It's like our brain is constantly rewiring itself, optimizing pathways based on what we do and what we learn. But our source pointed out that the relationship between these physical, structural changes at the synapse and the actual formation of a stable memory isn't always straightforward.
That's a really important nuance. You can sometimes detect memory formation behaviorally before the underlying structural changes, like the growth of new dendritic spines, are fully complete. And conversely, just because you see structural changes happening doesn't automatically guarantee that a strong, lasting memory has been formed. It's a complex interplay between function and structure involving many molecular players.
Okay, now research on growth factors called neurotrophins, like the famous BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, initially generated a lot of excitement, right? The idea was these factors support neuron growth and survival.
Yes, exactly. The discovery of BDNF and similar factors led to the very appealing hypothesis that increasing their levels in the brain could boost neuroplasticity, enhance learning, and maybe even help the brain recover from injury.
BDNF became the big hope for a while there, linked to exercise and brain health. What happened with that research clinically?
Well, unfortunately, despite a lot of promising early findings in cell cultures and some animal studies, clinical trials that attempted to increase BDNF levels in the human brain, either by directly administering the protein, which is difficult, or through gene therapy approaches, haven't really shown significant benefits for conditions like stroke or neurodegenerative diseases. Even in animal models, the results have often been disappointing or inconsistent when moving towards more complex applications.
Why not? It seemed like such a good idea.
It likely suggests that the network of these growth factors and other signaling molecules in the brain is incredibly complex and tightly regulated. Simply boosting one factor like BDNF might not be enough, or it might have off-target effects, or the brain might compensate in other ways. Neuronal plasticity almost certainly depends on much more than just the levels of these trophic factors.
What else is critical?
The actual activity of the synapses themselves seems crucial. Neurotransmitters like glutamate, which excites neurons, and neuromodulators like dopamine and serotonin, which influence the overall state of neural circuits, play critical roles in enabling and shaping plasticity. Selectively and safely targeting these intricate processes in specific ways in the human brain for therapeutic benefit is currently a major challenge.
So it's a much more intricate system than just adding more miracle grow for brain cells. Our source did mention optogenetics as a very powerful tool being used in animal research to probe these mechanisms.
Yes, optogenetics is a revolutionary technique. It allows scientists to insert light-sensitive proteins into specific types of neurons and then use targeted light delivery, often via fiber optics, to turn those neurons on or off with millisecond precision.
Wow.
This has enabled researchers to do incredible things in animal models, like demonstrating cause and effect relationships between the activity of specific circuits and behavior, creating new synapses, strengthening specific connections, and even artificially forming or erasing specific memories in mice.
Creating or erasing memories. That sounds like science fiction.
It does, but it's happening in labs. While this technology offers unparalleled potential for understanding the fundamental mechanisms of learning, memory, and plasticity, there are obviously significant technical and ethical considerations that currently prevent its direct application in humans for therapeutic purposes, outside of maybe some very specific research contexts.
Definitely some complex ethical lines we need to navigate carefully there. Okay, so if directly manipulating plasticity with drugs or light is still largely experimental, what are the practical things we can actually do to support our brain's natural plasticity every day?
Well, perhaps frustratingly, for those looking for a magic bullet, the most effective ways to support brain plasticity are actually those fundamental, sometimes boring lifestyle habits we often hear about.
The basics again.
The basics really do seem to matter most. Regular physical activity is consistently linked to better brain health and cognitive function. Ensuring you get enough quality sleep is critical. Eating a healthy, balanced diet like the Mediterranean diet seems beneficial. Maintaining a healthy weight, keeping your blood pressure and blood sugar levels well controlled, and managing chronic stress are all important. Sometimes this is called promoting eustress's manageable challenges rather than distress.
Okay, so taking care of our overall physical health is taking care of our brain health. Anything else?
Yes. Engaging in new and challenging activities. Learning new skills, whether it's a musical instrument, a language, or even complex games. Experiencing novelty and surprise. Continuously learning new things throughout your life seems to help maintain brain health and adaptability.
So staying curious and mentally active. And maybe even engaging our minds with new information, like, dare I say, listening to this deep dive, is a form of positive mental exercise.
Absolutely. Challenging your brain with new information and complex concepts, making connections, that's a great way to stimulate those neural networks and support plasticity. Now, shall we move on to our final, very timely topic? Human intelligence in the age of artificial intelligence.
Yes, let's. This is a conversation that's happening everywhere now, isn't it?
Hmm.
Our source shared some anecdotes about university students and even their tutors relying heavily on AI language models like ChatGPT to write essays or solve problems. It raises some really fundamental questions about what skills are truly important to learn these days and how AI might be changing our own cognitive development.
It does indeed. It forces us to reconsider what we value as intelligence and knowledge. Perhaps one way to think about it is that tasks that AI can now easily and reliably perform might not be the most crucial skills for humans to spend extensive time mastering in minute detail anymore.
Like mental arithmetic versus using a calculator.
Exactly. Think of it like memorizing multiplication tables. It's helpful, it builds number sense. But in an age of readily available calculators, is it strictly essential for everyone to have instant recall of 12 times 7? Maybe not. However, there's a potential downside, a risk we need to consider.
Which is?
The risk of not building a solid foundational understanding. If students consistently use AI to skip the basics, to get the answer without understanding the process, they might really struggle later on when they encounter more complex concepts that build upon that foundational knowledge they never truly grasped.
That makes sense. You can't build a skyscraper on shaky foundations.
Mm.
But our source also pointed out some potential upsides of AI, particularly in specialized fields.
Yes, definitely. In fields like medicine or biology, for example, AI tools can potentially automate or assist with tasks like basic programming, complex data analysis, or searching vast amounts of literature. This could free up doctors and scientists to focus their cognitive energy on their core expertise, on higher-level problem solving, patient interaction, or creative insights.
So it could be a powerful assistant. Now, what about the broader worries that relying on technology, smartphones, search engines, AI, is leading to a decline in our own cognitive abilities, making us lazy thinkers?
We've certainly seen similar anxieties emerge with previous technological advancements, haven't we? There were waves of concern about television, then computer games, then social media supposedly ruining attention spans or critical thinking.
I definitely remember the panics about video games making kids less intelligent and more aggressive back in the day.
Right. And interestingly, some recent research on computer games actually suggests the opposite, or at least no harm. Some studies indicate that children who play certain types of video games may exhibit certain cognitive advantages, like improved visual attention or problem-solving skills, might actually be less aggressive in some contexts, and generally show typical psychological development compared to peers who don't play.
Huh, okay. What about technology use in older adults?
Similarly, some epidemiological studies looking at older adults have linked regular computer use and engagement with technology with better long-term cognitive function and a potentially reduced risk of dementia.
Why would that be?
The hypothesis is that interacting with new technologies, learning new interfaces, troubleshooting problems, it provides a cognitive challenge, it keeps the brain active and engaged, which might be protective. So the idea that newer generations are becoming inherently less intelligent or cognitively weaker simply because of technology doesn't seem to be strongly supported by the current evidence.
That's actually quite reassuring. So engaging with technology isn't necessarily making us dumber. But what about the difference between just having instant access to vast amounts of information versus actually developing deeper understanding, wisdom, and critical thinking skills? Does tech help or hinder that?
That's a crucial distinction and a harder question to answer definitively. We know that even formal training in logic or critical thinking doesn't always translate well to applying those skills effectively in real-world situations outside the classroom.
Right, people can know the fallacies but still fall for them.
Exactly. The existence of things like critical thinking therapy highlights how persistent our cognitive biases can be, even when we intellectually understand logical principles. So, simply consuming more traditional forms of information, like reading books versus using the internet, doesn't automatically guarantee that someone becomes more intelligent, wiser, or a better critical thinker.
So the medium isn't necessarily the whole message.
Perhaps not entirely. The key takeaway here seems to be that while technology, including AI, offers incredible resources and tools, it's ultimately the ability to critically evaluate information, to synthesize knowledge from diverse sources, to ask good questions, and to apply understanding creatively. Those are the skills that truly matter, not just the ability to access facts quickly.
So the focus needs to be on developing those core critical thinking and learning muscles, regardless of what tools are available to us. Our source offered a nice historical perspective, reminding us that these kinds of concerns about new technologies negatively impacting our intellect or changing society for the worse have been around for centuries.
Absolutely. From the invention of writing itself, Plato famously worried it would weaken memory to the printing press, the telegraph, the radio, television, the internet. Each new major communication technology has been met with anxieties about its potential negative effects on our minds and our social fabric. It seems to be a recurring theme throughout human history.
That's a great point. Puts today's AI anxieties in context. Well, this has been a truly deep dive into just a fascinating array of brain mysteries. From those curious coincidences that make us wonder, to the complexities of dreams, the limits of hypnosis, and the incredible ongoing adaptability of our brains through plasticity, it's clear that there's still so much to uncover.
Indeed, it really underscores both the complexity and the wonder of the human brain and the fact that our understanding is constantly evolving, often in surprising ways. It's an exciting field to follow.
Absolutely. And on that note, here's maybe a final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. Given our brain's remarkable inherent ability to adapt and change throughout our lives, this neuroplasticity, we've talked about how should we, perhaps intentionally, shape our learning, our experiences, and even our engagement with technology in this rapidly evolving world. How do we best cultivate the specific kinds of intelligence, skills, and maybe even wisdom that will be most valuable and personally fulfilling in the years and decades to come?
That's a vital question for all of us to ponder as we navigate this increasingly complex landscape, isn't it? What does it mean to learn and thrive alongside increasingly capable machines?
Definitely food for thought. We'd love to hear your own thoughts, perspectives, and experiences on all of these topics we've touched on today. Feel free to connect with us and share what you've been thinking about.
Yes, please do.
And a huge thank you, as always, to our expert for sharing such clear and insightful perspectives on these complex subjects.
My pleasure. Always fascinating topics.
And of course, thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into the mysteries of the mind. Until next time, keep exploring those fascinating inner landscapes.